My fiancé smirked. The prenup means you lose everything if you walk away. I replied calmly. Then let's test that theory. Quietly filed evidence of her affair, let the judge read every message aloud in court, and watched her confident smile vanish instantly. The prenup means you lose everything if you walk away. She said it with a smirk. Not a nervous smirk, not an apologetic one. The kind that sits on someone's face when they think they've already won. I looked at her across the kitchen island. This woman I had planned to marry in 6 weeks, and felt something cold and very calm settle into my chest. Then let's test that theory, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam anything down on the counter. I just turned around, picked up my coffee mug, and walked to the living room like she'd said nothing more significant than pass the salt. But I wasn't calm because I was unbothered. I was calm because I had already decided. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Let me back up, because if I start from that kitchen moment, you'll think she was the villain from the very beginning. She wasn't. Or at least, I didn't see it that way for a long time. I'm in my mid-30s. I build commercial properties for a living. Project management, contracts, timelines, the kind of work that makes your hands feel useful even when everything around you feels uncertain. I met Vanessa at a charity auction 3 years ago. She wore a green dress and outbid everyone on a weekend skiing package without even flinching. I thought, that's either someone with a lot of money or someone with a lot of nerve. Turned out it was both. Her family had old money, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it never had to earn it. Her father owned several commercial real estate holdings across the Pacific Northwest, and her mother spent her days organizing fundraisers and quietly controlling everyone around her in a way she called guidance. Vanessa herself worked in branding and communications. She was sharp, funny, and unapologetically ambitious. I fell in love with her in about 4 months. I proposed after 2 years, and I signed the prenuptial agreement 7 months before the wedding because she presented it like a formality, something her family's attorney drew up to protect generational assets. I didn't fight it. I didn't even read the full 63 pages as carefully as I should have. I trusted her. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was ignoring the small things that started adding up around the 18-month mark of our engagement. The perfume that wasn't hers on a scarf she claimed she'd borrowed from a friend. The weekend trip to Portland she said was a girl's getaway, but her best friend Rochelle called our landline at home the same Saturday, asking if Vanessa wanted to do brunch. The late-night text she'd angle her phone away from before sliding it face down on the nightstand. I noticed, but I rationalized. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself this woman had chosen me, had said yes to spending her life with me, and that suspicion without proof was just fear wearing a disguise. So I kept building the life we had planned together. I kept signing things, coordinating venue deposits, telling my mother she was going to love the wedding in September. I kept trusting. The prenup conversation didn't come from nowhere. It started 2 weeks before that kitchen moment, during a dinner with her parents. Her father, a man named Theodore who wore linen shirts and gave opinions like they were gifts, mentioned offhand that the prenup had very favorable terms for the family if the marriage didn't last. I asked what he meant. He smiled the way people smile when they think you should already know the answer. Vanessa changed the subject. I let it go that night, but I didn't forget it. When we got home, I told her I wanted to reread the prenup. She said, "Why? Do you not trust me?" And I did the worst thing a person can do in that moment. I backed down. "Of course I do," I said. "Then stop acting like you don't," she replied, already walking upstairs. I pulled the prenup out of my filing cabinet 3 days later when she was at a client dinner. I sat at the kitchen table with a highlighter and read every single page. And there it was, buried on page 41, paragraph 7, subsection C. In the event the party of the second part terminates the marriage without documented evidence of the party of the first part's breach of contract or infidelity, all assets accumulated prior to the union and not specifically listed in Appendix D shall revert to the party of the first part. My business. My property investment account. The duplex I'd bought at 26 and held on to through 2 refinances. All of it. Gone. If I walked away without proof. I sat there for a long time. Not in panic. In calculation. Because something clicked into place that I hadn't let myself see clearly before. The prenup wasn't a formality. It was a trap. A beautifully dressed, politely presented, attorney-approved trap. And the smirk she gave me 2 weeks later in that kitchen When I finally confronted her about the Portland trip and the lies stacking up like unpaid debts. That smirk made perfect sense now. She thought I was cornered. She thought the document on page 41 had already decided everything. She thought I would back down. Again, I want to tell you about Connor, because this story doesn't make full sense without him. Connor was a partner at a brand strategy firm in Seattle. He and Vanessa had worked together on a campaign about 2 years into our relationship. She'd mentioned him once, casually, the way you mention someone who's professionally relevant and personally irrelevant. Connor and his team had some really sharp ideas in the meeting today. That was it. That was the only time she ever said his name to me directly, which is interesting, because his name appeared in her messages 114 times in the 9 months before that kitchen confrontation. I didn't go digging for his name right away. What actually started everything was a parking receipt. Vanessa had asked me to grab something from the glove box of her car, her insurance card, because she'd gotten a minor fender bender and needed it for a claim. When I opened the glove box, the insurance card fell out along with a folded receipt from a hotel valet. A hotel I'd never been to with her. Dated on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday she'd told me she was working late on a pitch. I stood in the driveway holding that receipt for probably 90 seconds. Then I folded it carefully, put it in my jacket pocket, put the glove box back together, and went inside like nothing had happened. I called Oliver that evening. Oliver is one of my oldest friends. We've known each other since college, and he went on to become a family law attorney. He's the kind of person who listens without interrupting, which is rarer than it sounds. I told him about the receipt. I told him about the prenup clause. I told him about the Portland lie, and the perfume, and the phone always face down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You need to document everything before you do anything." "I know," I said. "I mean everything," he repeated. "Don't confront her. Don't move money. Don't change behavior. Just collect." "How long?" "As long as it takes to make the case airtight," he said. "Because she has attorneys, and her family has money. And if you walk into that courtroom with a hotel receipt and a bad feeling, you will lose." I understood. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. I went to dinner with her family and smiled. I sat across from Theodore and smiled. I attended an engagement party hosted by Vanessa's mother, Gloria, who gave a speech about what a wonderful match her daughter had made, and I raised my glass and smiled. All while a part of my brain was quietly, methodically building a case. I hired a private investigator. Oliver recommended him. A former law enforcement professional named Declan, who had the energy of someone who found human deception mildly boring because he'd seen so much of it. "Tell me what you know," Declan said during our first meeting. I laid out everything. He took notes without blinking. "Give me 3 weeks," he said. He needed 10 days. The photographs were clinical in their clarity. Connor's car parked outside a boutique hotel on a Wednesday afternoon. Vanessa walking through the lobby, not looking left or right. The two of them leaving together the following morning. Time-stamped, geotagged, unambiguous. Declan handed me the folder across the table in a coffee shop and washed my face while I looked through it. I didn't cry. I think I had already grieved something by then, some version of Vanessa that had existed only in my imagination, and that I'd been quietly letting go of for weeks without fully acknowledging it. "Is this enough?" I asked. "For the prenup clause?" "This is a strong start," he said. "But your attorney will want communication records if you can get them." I nodded. "I thought you might say that." Here is where I need to be careful about what I say. I'm not going to tell you I did anything illegal. What I will tell you is that I had legitimate access to the family cell phone plan, because Vanessa had put both of us on it when we moved in together 18 months ago, and I was still technically the account holder. And when I called the carrier's customer service to discuss the account, I learned that as the primary account holder, I could request a detailed usage summary. I didn't read her private messages through any unauthorized means. I didn't access anything I had no right to access. What I had, beyond the usage records, was a separate set of messages that Vanessa had, at some point, accidentally synced to our shared kitchen tablet instead of keeping them only on her phone. She logged into her account on that tablet to show me a photo once, early in our engagement. She'd forgotten to log out. For 8 months, every message she sent had quietly mirrored itself onto that device sitting on the kitchen counter. I sat with the tablet one afternoon while she was at a lunch meeting and read what I needed to read. Not everything, just enough. The early messages with Connor were professional, then warmer, then intimate, then explicit. Then there were the messages that turned my stomach not because of what they said about him, but because of what they said about me. She described our engagement as a financial arrangement she was managing carefully. She'd told him she had made sure the prenup covered everything in case things went sideways. She'd written, in one message that I can still see word for word in my memory, a sentence I won't repeat here in full, but that ended with, "He'll never walk away. He's too invested. And if he does, he walks away with nothing." I made sure of that. I screenshot every relevant page. I emailed the files to Oliver. Then I closed the tablet, set it back on the kitchen counter exactly as I'd found it, and went and made dinner like a man who had just confirmed everything he needed to know. Oliver called me that night. "These are extraordinary," he said. "The prenup clause?" "Obliterated," he said simply. She essentially documented the premeditation of the financial manipulation in her own words. Combined with the photographs, this isn't just infidelity. This is a documented breach of contract under the very terms of the prenup she was using to threaten you. I exhaled slowly. "So what happens now?" "Now," Oliver said, "we file. But we time it carefully. And you don't say a word to her beforehand." "She's going to feel blindsided," I said. Oliver paused for a moment. "Yes," he agreed. "She is." The kitchen confrontation happened before I expected it to. Vanessa had come home from what I now understood was not a client dinner. She was in a good mood, the kind that feels slightly performative when you know what's underneath it. I made the mistake of being too quiet that evening, too still, too inside my own thoughts. She noticed. "What's wrong with you?" she asked. "Nothing," I said. "You've been weird for weeks," she said, leaning against the counter with her arms crossed. And something cracked open in me. Not rage, not grief, just a specific exhaustion with the entire performance of it. "I know about Portland," I said. She didn't blink. "What about Portland?" "I know you weren't with Rochelle." A silence settled between us, dense and specific, the kind that has weight. Then she tilted her head and said it. The line she had apparently prepared. The one she'd been holding in reserve. "The prenup means you lose everything if you walk away." Cool. Certain. Practiced. Like she'd rehearsed it for the exact scenario where I finally pushed past the point of polite pretending. Like she'd been waiting for this moment and had already mapped every exit and decided she had all of them covered and locked. And I looked at her. This woman in the kitchen of the house we'd shared, with the September wedding 6 weeks away and the venue deposit paid and the invitations already sent, and I felt the last version of who we used to be leave the room entirely. "Then let's test that theory," I said, and I walked to the living room and sat down with my coffee. She came in after me. I think she expected tears or shouting or some kind of collapse that would give her something to respond to. Instead, she found me on the couch, watching nothing, completely composed in a way that clearly unsettled her. "You don't have the money to fight my family's attorneys," she said. "Probably not," I agreed. "And even if you try, the prenup is airtight." "Seems like it," I said. She stared at me, searching my face for whatever she'd expected to find there. "So what are you going to do?" I looked at her. "I'm going to go to bed," I said. And I did. I moved out the following week. Not dramatically. I packed a bag and told her I needed space to think, which she received with something between relief and suspicion. I stayed with Oliver and his wife Bridget for 3 weeks while everything was being filed and organized and carefully prepared. Bridget made coffee every morning and asked no questions about any of it, which was the greatest kindness anyone showed me during that entire period. During those weeks, Declan gathered 2 additional layers of documentation. Hotel check-in records from 3 separate dates spanning 8 months. A witness statement from a restaurant server who recognized Connor and Vanessa from a standing Tuesday dinner reservation they'd kept with quiet regularity. And a series of financial transfers Vanessa had made from a joint savings account we'd opened together. Transfers to an account I didn't recognize, in amounts small enough to avoid immediate attention but consistent enough to constitute, in Oliver's words, a deliberate and documented pattern of financial misdirection. She hadn't just been having an affair. She'd been moving money, methodically. The filing hit her attorney's office on a Thursday morning. Oliver told me it landed at 9:14 a.m. Vanessa called me at 9:47 a.m. I didn't answer. She called 3 more times before noon. Then her mother called. Then Theodore called, linen shirts, gifts as opinions, the whole version of him. I let all of them go to voicemail without listening to any of them. Then I turned my phone face down on the table and finished my breakfast in the quiet of Oliver's kitchen. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Vanessa's attorneys, and there were 3 of them, which tells you something about how that Thursday morning had gone in their camp, filed an immediate motion to dismiss based on the prenup agreement's terms. Oliver had expected this. He filed a counter motion within 48 hours, citing the breach of contract clause within the prenup itself, supported by the photographs, the financial transfers, the hotel records, and the witness statement. He also formally flagged the tablet messages for admissibility. The messages where Vanessa had written, in her own words, exactly what she'd done and why, and what she believed the outcome would be. Her attorneys pushed back hard on the admissibility question. Oliver pushed harder. The judge ruled on the counter motion after reviewing the documentation. The messages would be admissible. I want to tell you about the weeks leading up to the court date because they shaped something in me that I didn't fully understand until later. Vanessa tried several different approaches during that period. First came the apologetic text, sent 3 days after the filing. I know I hurt you. I'm sorry. Can we please talk before this goes further? I didn't respond. Then came the softer approach through Camille, her friend who I'd always genuinely liked, who called me with visible discomfort in her voice to say that Vanessa was not doing well and really wanted the chance to make this right. I told Camille I appreciated her reaching out and that I genuinely wished Vanessa well. But things are already in motion, I said. Camille was quiet for a moment. She didn't think you'd actually do it, she said. I know, I replied. She thought you'd back down. I know that too, I said. She wasn't wrong about who I used to be. Then there was the letter, handwritten, which surprised me in the way that small details sometimes catch you off guard when the larger picture is clear. Vanessa had always had beautiful handwriting. One of those small, specific personal details that lodges in memory and stays long after everything else is shifted. The letter was 3 pages long and written in that handwriting. It acknowledged the affair. It expressed remorse in measured, carefully chosen language. It did not acknowledge the financial manipulation. It did not acknowledge the tablet messages. It asked me to consider the life we had built together and whether I really wanted to burn it down over a mistake. I read it twice, sitting at Oliver's kitchen table in the early morning. Then I handed it to Oliver when he came downstairs. He added it to the file without comment. Not because it helped the case, but because he said the language of it, the selective acknowledgement, the framing of deliberate choices as singular mistakes, might matter in how the judge understood the full picture. I should tell you about my sister Kate. She's 4 years younger than me, lives in Denver, and has never in her entire life softened something she believed to be true simply because the truth was inconvenient. She flew out when she heard what was happening, without being asked. She showed up at Oliver's house with a rolling suitcase and a bottle of whiskey and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said 4 words, "Tell me everything. Now." So I told her. All of it, from the glove box receipt to the tablet to the kitchen confrontation to the filing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Did you love her?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I think I loved the version of her I believed existed." "That's not the same thing as loving her," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "You didn't deserve this," she said. "No, and you're doing the right thing." "I think so." "You know so," she said, with the specific firmness of someone who does not offer certainty unless they mean it. "And so does she. That's exactly why she's scared." Kate stayed for 8 days. She didn't try to fix anything or accelerate anything or tell me how I was supposed to feel at any given point. She just made sure I wasn't carrying it alone. That was everything. The morning of the court date arrived with the ordinary indifference of all days that turn out to matter. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm. I showered, put on the charcoal suit Oliver had advised, not expensive enough to seem arrogant, professional enough to be credible, and ate a piece of toast I tasted approximately none of. Kate dropped me at the courthouse steps. "You good?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "You don't have to be," she offered. "I know," I said. "But I am." She nodded, and I got out of the car, and she drove away, and I walked up the steps. Vanessa was already inside when I arrived. She was seated at the opposite table with her 3 attorneys arranged around her, and when I walked through the door, I watched her track me across the room with an expression I recognized. Composed, controlled, navy blue jacket, hair done, posture right. She'd shown up prepared to project certainty. She looked at me once, directly, as I settled beside Oliver. I looked back. Neither of us said anything. Neither of us smiled. The proceedings opened the way legal proceedings always do. Formal language and filed documents and attorneys addressing the judge with the particular rhythm of people who have performed this function so many times that genuine crisis has become entirely routine to them. Harriet, Vanessa's lead attorney, silver-haired, formidably precise, clearly excellent at her job, argued the prenup clause with the confidence of someone who had reviewed the document thoroughly and believed she was standing on solid ground. The termination of the engagement by the party of the second part. No documented breach on the part of the first. Asset reversion as specified in writing on page 41. She was persuasive. I watched Judge Bernard Calloway, who had the particular look of a man who had heard every available variation of human self-justification across 3 decades on the bench and had stopped being surprised by any of it. Listen without expression. When Harriet concluded, Oliver stood. "Your Honor," he said, "the party of the second part would like to submit Exhibits A through M for the court's consideration as documentation of a clear and demonstrable breach of the prenuptial agreement's core terms, specifically the infidelity clause on page 41 and the financial misconduct clause on page 57. Harriet's head turned. Just a fraction. But in a courtroom that quiet, a fraction is visible. The photographs were reviewed first. The judge looked at each one without comment. Then the financial transfer records. Then the hotel documentation and the witness statement from the restaurant server. Harriet objected to the server's statement as hearsay. Oliver had prepared for this 2 weeks in advance. The server's phone deposition had already been entered into the record. Objection overruled. And then Exhibit L arrived in front of the judge. The tablet messages. Judge Calloway looked at the printed transcripts for a long, unhurried moment. Then he looked up over his reading glasses, across to Harriet. "Counselor, are your client's communications being disputed as falsified or misrepresented in any way?" Harriet conferred in low, urgent tones with Vanessa for several seconds. "We dispute the context in which they are being presented to the court, Your Honor." "I see," Calloway said. He settled back in his chair slightly. "Then I'll read them into the record so that the context is entirely and unambiguously clear for all parties present." I had known this was possible. Oliver had told me, before we filed, that a judge might choose to read communications into the record if their authenticity was contested. He had told me to be prepared for it. But there is a meaningful difference between being told something can happen and sitting inside a courtroom while it does. Judge Calloway read aloud. His voice was even, measured, stripped of editorial weight. The room was very quiet in the way that rooms are when everyone in them is holding still. He read the message where Vanessa described Connor as the only one who fully understood her. He read the one where she detailed plans they'd made. He read the one describing me as manageable. And then he read the one I had memorized without intending to, the one that had embedded itself somewhere permanent in my memory from the first time I read it on the kitchen counter. He'll never walk away. He's too invested. And if he does, he walks away with nothing. I made sure of that. I watched her face while the words were in the air. I want to be precise about what I saw, because it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the composed certainty she'd carried into the room. It wasn't anger or defiance, or the kind of cold calculation I'd seen in the kitchen. It was something smaller and more truthful than any of those. The confident smile, the architectural twin of the smirk she'd worn when she said I'd lose everything. The expression she'd brought into this courtroom like armor she'd spent weeks fitting, just dissolved. Not all at once. Not dramatically. The way a light fades rather than switches off. Her jaw tightened for one moment. Her eyes moved from the judge to the table directly in front of her. Her shoulders, which had been squared with precision since I'd walked in, lost something, some internal structural support that had been holding them there. And the woman who had spent months arranging the terms of her victory, who had calculated every exit and believed she'd locked every door, sat very still in her navy blue jacket and looked, for the first time in all the months I had known her in this sharpened version of herself, like someone who had run out of moves entirely. Judge Calloway set the papers down. He looked across both sides of the room. "In light of the evidence submitted and entered into the record," he said, "the motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement's asset reversion clause under the current circumstances is denied." He continued in the same measured tone. "The financial transfers would be subject to separate proceedings to be scheduled accordingly. The documented infidelity and financial misconduct constituted a clear breach of the prenuptial agreement's core terms by the party of the first part. The party of the second part was not liable for any asset forfeiture under the applicable clauses." Oliver exhaled slowly beside me. Not in triumph. Not with any performance of victory. Just in the particular, quiet way of someone who had done their job carefully and was watching it hold under the exact pressure it was designed to withstand. The hearing ended. Attorneys gathered papers. The room began to breathe and move again. I sat still for a moment while everyone around me transitioned. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I was trying to locate something, some memory of who I'd been before the glove box receipt and the kitchen counter and the 63 pages of fine print I'd signed without reading. I was trying to remember the version of myself that had stood in a charity auction room and thought, that's someone with a lot of nerve, and felt something that seemed, at the time, like the beginning of something real. And I found, sitting in that courtroom with Oliver's hand briefly on my shoulder, that I didn't feel victorious. I felt something quieter than victory, something that had no drama in it at all. I felt free. Vanessa and I didn't speak after the hearing. Not in the hallway, not on the steps, not by message in the days that followed. Her attorneys and Oliver continued their necessary communications as the additional proceedings were arranged. There were further hearings related to the financial transfers, the details of which remain part of an ongoing record that Oliver has advised me not to detail publicly. What I can tell you, plainly, is this. The duplex is mine. The business accounts are mine. The property investment account I'd built and held and protected through 2 refinances and one very expensive and revealing legal proceeding remains exactly where it should be. Everything I had built, I kept. Theodore called me once, about 3 weeks after the court date. I was walking Brisket. I'll get to Brisket, through the neighborhood in the evening when his name appeared on my phone. I considered letting it go. Then I answered. I don't know what I expected from him exactly. Authority, maybe, or disappointment weaponized as dignity, or the linen shirt certainty I'd watched him project across so many dinner tables over 3 years. What I got was silence after I picked up. Then, I want you to know I didn't know the full extent of it. I said nothing. The clause on page 41, that was added after the initial draft. At her request, I wasn't made aware of the specific language until the proceedings. Another silence. I thought it was about protecting assets, he said. Not about. He stopped. I understand, I said. I'm not sure you do, he said quietly. You're right, I said. I probably don't entirely. He cleared his throat. For what it's worth, he started. It's worth something, I told him. There was a pause. I'm sorry, he said. And then he hung up. I thought about that call for a long time afterward. Not because it changed anything concrete, but because it reminded me that there are rarely clean lines between people who deliberately choose harm and people who create conditions for harm without examining what they're building. Theodore had handed his daughter a legal instrument and called it family protection. Vanessa had repurposed it into something else entirely and called it insurance. I had almost let both of them convince me it was simply the reality of how things work, that this was the natural order of money and marriage and expectation, and that the correct response was quiet, dignified acceptance. That's what stays with me most. Not the betrayal of the affair. Not even the specific calculation of the prenup manipulation. It's that moment in the kitchen when she said, "You lose everything if you walk away." And I almost believed her. Almost decided that absorbing the loss was preferable to the uncertainty of whatever fighting might look like. Almost chose the cage because at least I understood its dimensions. Almost. Kate flew back to Denver a few weeks after the court date. Before she left, we sat on Oliver's back porch on one of those early autumn evenings that have the particular quality of light that makes everything feel briefly like something worth holding on to. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I'd been sitting with that question. I had the Valley project starting in November, a commercial development that would take most of the next year and give my hands and my mind the specific occupation they'd needed for a while. I had my duplex. I had Oliver and Bridget and their table and their coffee and their complete and generous willingness not to make this larger or more symbolic than it needed to be. I had whoever I was turning into, now that I had the space to find out. "Work," I said. "Sleep properly. Maybe get a dog." Kate laughed, "A real one, without performance." "A dog," she repeated. "I've always wanted one," I said. She was allergic. "Get a big one," Kate said. And I was smiling. Without constructing it. Without managing it for anyone's benefit. Just a real, unguarded smile that arrived on its own and stayed there in the autumn light. And I didn't do anything to justify it or explain it away. Here is what I want to say about trust and about signing things without reading them, and about the particular blindness that comes from wanting something to be real. I signed a 63-page legal document without reading it carefully because I loved someone and I didn't want to behave like I was already anticipating failure. That's a human impulse. I understand exactly why I had it. But love isn't the same as surrender. And trust isn't the same as willful ignorance dressed in the language of faith. The version of me who stood in that driveway holding a valet receipt, who folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and said nothing and went inside and made dinner, made the right call. Not because he was calculating, but because he understood, standing there in the cold air beside her car, that truth doesn't stop being true simply because you haven't confirmed it yet. And that sometimes the most powerful response available to you is to stay quiet, to stay patient, to gather what you need with steady hands, and to let the evidence speak for itself in a room where someone else has to read every word of it aloud. Some months later, a mutual acquaintance reached out, the kind of reaching out that presents itself as concern but is really the delivery of information the person believes you'll want to have, to let me know that Vanessa and Connor were no longer together. That whatever arrangement they'd built had not survived the scrutiny of proceedings or the public record or whatever private reckoning followed. I received this information and felt nothing recognizable. Not satisfaction, not relief, not pity or vindication or the complicated pleasure of watching consequences land. Just nothing. Because her choices after me had no chapter left in my story. She had tried to write the ending for both of us, to lock it in on page 41, paragraph 7, subsection C, with 3 attorneys and a rehearsed smirk and 18 months of careful preparation. She had not succeeded. I kept my own ending. That was everything I needed. The Valley project started in November, out on site in the early mornings with cold air and the specific satisfaction of work that has weight and measurement and real consequence. I hired a young project coordinator named Felix who was 24 and unreasonably enthusiastic about drainage systems and load calculations, which I found both baffling and completely charming. I got Brisket, large, profoundly uncomplicated golden mix who has no opinions about legal filings or prenuptial agreements or the motivations of anyone in his immediate environment, and who requires only breakfast, dinner, and someone to throw a tennis ball across the backyard at approximately 7:15 each evening. Brisket has never once looked at me with calculation behind his eyes. It is extraordinary, genuinely, unexpectedly extraordinary, how restorative that is. Oliver and Bridget had me over for dinner in December. The 4 of us, Oliver, Bridget, Kate on her holiday visit, and me, sat around their table and ate pot roast and argued with genuine passion about a documentary series we'd all watched and disagreed about in different ways. Nobody mentioned the court case. Nobody mentioned Vanessa or prenuptial agreements or page 41. Just dinner. Just people who genuinely liked each other in a warm room with food and thoroughly imperfect opinions about cinema and everything working the way it was supposed to. At some point late in the evening, after the wine and the argument had settled into comfortable quiet, Oliver looked at me from across the table. "You did good," he said. Not about the case specifically, about the whole shape of how I'd handled it. I looked back at him. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it without any qualification or reservation. I think about the smirk sometimes. The one in the kitchen. It's not painful anymore. It's just a data point, like the valet receipt or the tablet or the 114 messages. A moment when someone showed me exactly who they were and exactly what they believed about me, and I had enough stillness and enough evidence and enough of a decision already made to respond not with emotion, but with simple intention. Then let's test that theory. 5 words. No raised voice. No trembling hands. No dramatic speech about betrayal or love or broken promises. Just the quiet, settled response of a man who had already gathered everything he needed and was simply waiting for the right room in which to present it. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I was the same person who'd folded when she asked me not to reread the prenup, who'd backed down in every silence that got too uncomfortable, who'd made peace with whatever version of reality she offered because the alternative felt too uncertain. She wasn't wrong about who I had been. For a significant portion of that relationship, that description would have been accurate. But she had missed the precise moment when that stopped being true. It happened in a driveway, on an ordinary afternoon, with a folded piece of paper from a hotel valet in my hand. No announcement. No dramatic internal monologue. Just a quiet, private decision about what I was and wasn't going to accept. That was the actual turning point. Everything after it was just the work of honoring it. The Valley project wrapped 18 months after it started. On the last day, Felix brought a pink box of glazed donuts to the site, and everyone stood around in hard hats eating them and taking photos in front of what we'd built together. It wasn't the largest project I'd ever managed, not the most complex or the most profitable, but it was the first thing I completed entirely as the person I actually was, without managing someone's expectations of me, without performing a version of myself calibrated to be acceptable, without the constant quiet background pressure of a relationship that had been using who I was against me for longer than I'd let myself see. I drove home that evening with Brisket riding shotgun, head out the window, ears pushed back by the speed, utterly indifferent to everything except the wind and wherever we happened to be going. We pulled into the driveway of the duplex, the one I'd bought at 26, the one I'd refinanced twice and nearly lost once and fought to keep through a legal proceeding that cost me more than money, the one that had always been mine and remained mine. I sat in the car for a moment before going in, just sat in the driveway in the early evening. No inventory of what had been lost, no list of what had almost gone differently, just the sky doing what autumn skies do, and the dog giving me his patient sideways look of mild incomprehension, and the clean, uncomplicated feeling of someone who had been told with absolute confidence and a perfectly rehearsed smirk that they would lose everything, and hadn't. There is something I haven't mentioned yet, something I've been sitting with since well before the court date, and that I think belongs in this account if it's going to be honest. I almost stopped, not once, but several times across those 6 weeks between the filing and the hearing. The first time was a Wednesday night, about 2 weeks after I'd moved in with Oliver. I'd been lying in the guest room, unable to sleep, which had become the default state of 3 in the morning, and I started doing the calculation in my head, not of assets or legal outcomes, but of years. 3 years we'd been together. 2 of those years I genuinely believed I was building something with another person who wanted the same thing. And even knowing what I knew by then, the tablet, the photographs, the money moving quietly into accounts I'd never been told about, even with all of it confirmed and documented and sitting in Oliver's files, some part of me spent that Wednesday at 3 in the morning grieving the years in a way I hadn't let myself do during the day. Not grieving Vanessa exactly, grieving the version of my life I'd been living inside. The one where September was a wedding month and not a legal proceeding. The one where I'd actually believed the charity auction moment was how love was supposed to start, with someone in a green dress outbidding everyone without flinching, and me thinking that kind of nerve was something I wanted close to me. I didn't stop, but I want to be honest that stopping crossed my mind, because stopping would have been easier in one very specific and very temporary way. And I knew even at 3 in the morning that temporary ease was exactly what she had been counting on me to choose. The second time I almost stopped was after the handwritten letter. I've mentioned it already. 3 pages, beautiful handwriting, the selective acknowledgement, the framing of deliberate choices as singular mistakes. But what I haven't said is that I sat with that letter for most of an evening. I read it more than twice. There was one paragraph, about halfway through page 2, where the language shifted, where it became less careful and more unguarded, and for a few minutes I thought I was reading something true. Something underneath all the calculation. A person saying, I made choices I can't explain, and I understand that what I built wasn't real, and I'm sorry in a way that the rest of this letter doesn't say well enough. That paragraph cost me an evening. I sat with it and turned it over and tried to determine whether it was real or whether it was simply the most finely calibrated part of the whole document, the piece designed specifically for someone like me, the person she described in those messages as too invested to walk away. I decided I couldn't know, and that not knowing didn't change what was already in motion. Oliver added it to the file. I went to bed. I also want to tell you about the engagement party, the one I attended with a smile, while Declan's photos already existed and Oliver's countermotion was already being drafted. Gloria, Vanessa's mother, had organized it at a venue in the hills, the kind of event where everything is arranged to look effortless but represents weeks of very deliberate coordination. There were flowers and small plates of food and string lights, and about 60 people who all seemed genuinely happy for us. Genuinely happy for me. Several of Vanessa's relatives shook my hand and told me I was a good man and that they were glad she'd found me. Her cousin, a sharp and warm woman named Beatrice who I'd always liked, pulled me aside near the end of the evening and said, You're good for her, you know. She's different with you. I remember the specific texture of that moment. The string lights. The glass in my hand. Beatrice's expression, which was entirely without irony or performance. Thank you, I said, and I raised my glass when Gloria made the speech. And I smiled when Theodore shook my hand and said something about looking forward to the September ceremony. And inside, Some very composed and very sad part of me was thinking, this is the last night of this version of things. After this, everything becomes evidence. I want to tell you one more thing about what it felt like to sit in that courtroom. Not the moment the messages were read. Before that, the early part of the hearing, when Harriet was arguing the prenup clause and doing it well, and I was sitting beside Oliver and looking at the back of Vanessa's head. She had a particular way of sitting. Always had, always with that precise posture, the slight set of the shoulders that meant she was prepared and ready and had considered every variable. I'd always associated it with competence, with the version of her I'd admired. And sitting there watching it, knowing what I knew, knowing what was in the file Oliver had submitted, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not anger, something closer to sadness, but specific. The sadness of seeing someone be exactly who they are and understanding that you are past the point of wishing it were different. That the version of them you loved was real enough to grieve and gone enough to let go of. That's a strange thing to feel in a courtroom, but it was honest, and I've tried to be honest throughout this account, so that's what I'm telling you. After everything was settled, and the paperwork was in order, and the life I'd built was still intact, I took a week off. Not to travel anywhere or do anything restorative in the way people suggest. I just worked on the duplex. It needed painting in 2 of the upstairs rooms, and there was a section of the kitchen floor that had been on my list for 2 years and always got deferred because there was always something else requiring attention. I spent 5 days doing quiet, uncomplicated work with my hands. Painting, measuring, fixing the kitchen floor. By myself, with a podcast playing in the background and Brisket, who I'd picked up that very first week, lying in whatever patch of afternoon sun moved across the floor as the day went on. It was the most ordinary 5 days I'd had in over a year. And ordinary, I discovered, had become something I genuinely valued in a way I hadn't before. Not because ordinary meant small, but because ordinary meant real. Things that were exactly what they appeared to be. Work that produced a tangible result. A dog who needed breakfast and a tennis ball and nothing else. A home that was mine in a way that nothing had tried to take. Oliver came over at the end of that week to check in. He brought coffee from the place near his office that we'd been going to since before either of us had adult responsibilities. We sat at my kitchen table, the one where I'd spread 63 pages of prenuptial agreement with a highlighter, and drank coffee and talked about almost nothing. His kids, a project I had coming up, a restaurant he and Bridget had tried. At some point he looked around the kitchen, at the patched floor section and the painted door frame visible from where we sat, and said, "Looks good." "Needed doing," I said. He nodded. We finished the coffee. He left. That was it. That was the full shape of the conversation. And I stood in the kitchen afterward thinking that this, just this, was what I had been fighting for. Not to punish anyone. Not to win. Just to keep the life I had actually built. To keep the duplex and the table and the ordinary Tuesday morning with a friend who brought coffee and didn't need anything from me except the same. That was what page 41 had almost taken. That was what it didn't get.